beneath the sand, there are stones that remember. They rest where they have rested for thousands of years, patient and undisturbed. Their surfaces smooth as glass, their edges sharp as the day they were cut. These are not the grand monuments that draw tourists and scholars. These are the forgotten ones, the enigmatic ones. The stones that whisper questions no one wants to hear. At Abu Rawash, north of the pyramids of Giza, there sits a massive granite block. It weighs perhaps 40 tons. Its surface has been machined, polished to a reflective finish that even modern equipment would struggle to replicate. Running across its face are grooves, perfectly parallel, each one exactly 3 millimeters deep. The spacing between them never varies by more than a fraction of a millimeter across the entire expanse of stone. No hieroglyphs adorn this block. No cartouche claims it for any pharaoh. It simply exists, anonymous and perfect. A technological artifact without context or explanation. Conventional Egyptology dates this work to the time of the 4th dynasty, around 2600 BCE. This was supposedly the age of copper chisels and wooden mallets, of patient craftsmen working stone with abrasive sand and determination. Yet when engineers examine these grooves, when they measure their precision and calculate the forces required to create them, they encounter a persistent problem. The mathematics don't cooperate with the narrative. Granite is one of the hardest stones on Earth, rating 7 on the Mohs scale. Copper, the primary metal available to Old Kingdom Egyptians, rates between 2.5 and 3. In practical terms, this means copper cannot cut granite. It can only abrade it, slowly, laboriously, using harder materials as intermediaries. Sand containing quartz might serve this purpose. Diorite pounders might work. But neither method explains the precision observed in these grooves. The grooves are not merely straight. They are parallel to tolerances measured in microns. They are evenly spaced across distances of several meters. They show no signs of the wandering, the variation, the human error that should inevitably appear in work performed by hand over extended periods. Some researchers have attempted to replicate these grooves using ancient methods. The results have been instructive. After hours of work, they produce grooves that are approximately straight, approximately parallel, approximately evenly spaced. The approximations are significant. The ancient grooves contain no approximations. This granite block is not unique. Similar precision appears on granite cores extracted from drill holes at Giza, on the interior surfaces of massive sarcophagi, on altar stones and offering tables scattered across Egypt's archaeological landscape. Each instance presents the same puzzle. Each one whispers the same uncomfortable question. If these artifacts genuinely date to the Bronze Age, how were they made? And if the conventional dating is correct, but the methods are unknown, what does that absence of knowledge suggest about the completeness of our understanding? The alternative, rarely spoken aloud in academic circles, is that these stones may not originate from the culture that claimed them, that they may be older than the pyramids, older than the pharaohs, older than the earliest dynasties recorded in Egyptian history. that they may be relics of something that came before. Before we can understand what vanished, we must first establish that something vanished at all. The evidence is scattered, fragmentary, resistant to simple interpretation. It does not announce itself clearly. It hides in plain sight, in museum storerooms, and beneath desert sands, in the foundations of temples and the walls of tombs. It waits for observers willing to look without preconceptions, to measure without assumption, to question without fear of professional consequences. The investigation begins not with grand theories, but with simple observations, with measurements, with comparisons, with the patient accumulation of anomalies that resist explanation within existing frameworks. Consider the stone vessels discovered beneath the step pyramid at Saqqara. Consider the massive granite boxes resting in the Serapeum's underground tunnels. Consider the precision drill cores that show spiral grooves descending into solid granite at rates that seem impossible for the tools available. Consider the saw marks on basalt blocks that indicate blade lengths of 9 feet or more, cutting through one of the hardest stones known to ancient workers. Each artifact is a data point. Each measurement is a constraint on possible explanations. Each failed replication attempt using reconstructed ancient methods narrows the range of plausible scenarios. The stones do not lie. They can be measured with modern instruments. Their dimensions can be verified. Their tolerances can be calculated. Their material properties can be analyzed. And when all these measurements are compiled, when all the data is examined without preconception, a pattern emerges. The pattern suggests capabilities that exceed the conventional understanding of Bronze Age technology. It suggests knowledge that appears suddenly in the archaeological record, without clear antecedents. It suggests to some researchers the possibility of inheritance rather than independent invention. This hypothesis faces immediate challenges from mainstream archaeology. It requires explanations for why a preceding civilization would leave so few traces. It demands evidence that has not yet been conclusively found. It contradicts the gradualist model of cultural development that dominates archaeological theory. Yet the artifacts remain patient, precise, waiting for explanations that can account for their existence without requiring intellectual compromises or willful blindness to the technical challenges they present. The granite block at Abu Rawash is not alone in its precision. The quarries of Aswan, where much of Egypt's granite was extracted, there are unfinished obelisks and abandoned blocks showing tool marks that have puzzled engineers for decades. The marks suggest cutting rates through solid granite that seem inconsistent with copper tools and abrasive sand. They show depths and angles that appear to require equipment more sophisticated than anything attributed to the Old Kingdom. One particular drill core, extracted from the granite at Giza and now residing in the Petrie Museum in London, shows a spiral groove that descends into the stone at a rate of 1 inch per revolution of the drill. This is an extraordinary cutting rate for granite, a rate that modern diamond-tipped drills can achieve, but that seems impossible for Bronze Age technology. Engineer Christopher Dunn has examined this core extensively. He has calculated the forces required to achieve this cutting rate using copper tools and abrasive sand. His calculations suggest that the downward pressure needed would have crushed any known ancient drilling apparatus. the drill would have had to apply several tons of force while simultaneously rotating smoothly and maintaining perfect alignment. Conventional archaeology explains these drill cores by invoking hollow tube drills made of copper, used with wet sand as an abrasive. The drill would have been rotated manually or by means of a bow drill mechanism, gradually wearing through the granite by abrasion rather than cutting. Given sufficient time and patience, this method could theoretically produce the observed results. Yet when experimental archaeologists attempt to replicate these cores using reconstructed ancient methods, they encounter persistent problems. The drill bits wander. The holes become oval rather than circular. The cutting rate is far slower than the ancient examples suggest. The spiral grooves, if they appear at all, are irregular and inconsistent. The ancient cores show none of these deficiencies. The holes are perfectly circular. The spiral grooves are evenly spaced and consistent in depth. The cutting rate is uniform throughout the core's length. The precision suggests either a level of skill far exceeding modern experimental attempts, or technology different from what conventional archaeology has proposed. Similar questions arise when examining the massive sarcophagi found in various pyramids and tombs throughout Egypt. These sarcophagi were carved from single blocks of granite or basalt, hollowed out to precise dimensions and polished to mirror finishes on both interior and exterior surfaces. The King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid contains a granite sarcophagus that has been measured using modern precision instruments. The interior dimensions vary by less than 2 millimeters across the entire volume. The corners are sharp and crisp. The walls are uniform in thickness. The exterior is polished smooth. This sarcophagus is larger than the entrance corridor leading to the King's Chamber, meaning it must have been installed during the pyramid's construction before the ceiling blocks were positioned. Yet the chamber that contains it sits more than 150 feet above the pyramid's base, accessible only through narrow passages and ascending galleries. How was this sarcophagus carved? How was it transported to the chamber? How was it positioned with such precision in a space barely larger than the sarcophagus itself? And why was such precision necessary for what was supposedly a burial container? Conventional explanations invoke enormous labor inputs, sophisticated wooden scaffolding and ramps that have left no archaeological trace, and generations of skilled craftsmen passing down techniques that were later lost. These explanations are not impossible. Human determination and ingenuity can achieve remarkable results with simple tools. But the explanations feel incomplete. They account for the what, but struggle with the how. They describe the end result, but cannot fully demonstrate the process. They invoke lost knowledge to explain achievements that modern attempts cannot replicate. And so the questions persist. The stones remain silent. The grooves and drill cores and polished surfaces wait patiently for theories that can accommodate their existence without requiring abandonment of either the evidence or the constraints of Bronze Age technology. Some researchers have begun to suggest that perhaps the constraints themselves need re-examination. Perhaps the Bronze Age was not as technologically limited as conventional archaeology assumes. Perhaps knowledge and capabilities existed that have not survived in the archaeological record. Perhaps the story of human technological development is not the smooth upward progression that modern narratives often assume, but something more complex, with peaks and valleys, achievements and losses, knowledge gained and knowledge forgotten. This perspective opens difficult questions about how history is written, who writes it, and what assumptions underlie the frameworks through which we interpret the past. It challenges the comfortable notion that we moderns sit at the apex of human capability, looking back at progressively more primitive ancestors. It suggests instead that human history may be more cyclical, that civilizations can rise and fall, that knowledge can be lost as well as gained, that the present does not necessarily exceed all that came before. These are unsettling ideas for a culture accustomed to narratives of progress. They suggest that the monuments of ancient Egypt may represent not the dawn of human capability, but perhaps an echo of something earlier, something that has been largely forgotten, but that left traces in stone for those willing to examine them without preconception. In the vast subterranean chambers beneath the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, archaeologists discovered something that should not exist, according to conventional understanding of technological development. More than 40,000 stone vessels. Not pottery, not ceramic, not clay shaped and fired in kilns. Stone. Hard stone. Carved from single blocks of the most difficult materials available to ancient workers. Granite, diorite, basalt, schist, alabaster. Materials that resist cutting and shaping. Materials that fracture unpredictably. Materials that require modern carbide or diamond tools to work efficiently. The vessels vary enormously in size and form. Some are small, delicate things, thin-walled as eggshells, light enough to lift with one hand. Others are substantial, large enough to hold several liters of liquid, heavy enough to require 2 people to move. Many possess long, narrow necks rising from bulbous bodies, shapes that would challenge even modern lathes. Some have handles carved from the same block as the vessel itself, requiring the removal of stone from impossibly tight spaces without breaking the delicate walls surrounding them. The precision documented on these vessels defies easy explanation. Engineer Christopher Dunn, who specializes in precision manufacturing and has decades of experience with high-tolerance machining, examined several of these vessels using modern metrology equipment, including laser scanners and coordinate measuring machines. His measurements revealed symmetry accurate to within a few thousandths of an inch. The walls maintain uniform thickness throughout, varying by less than a millimeter, even in vessels with complex curves and internal geometries. The curves themselves are mathematically perfect, following consistent radii that do not deviate, despite being executed in stone that naturally fractures along unpredictable planes. Some of the most remarkable vessels are made from schist, a metamorphic rock notorious its tendency to split along natural foliation planes. Working schist is extraordinarily difficult, even with modern tools. The stone wants to fracture in particular directions determined by its internal structure. Carving it into thin sections or subjecting it to percussion almost inevitably results in splitting and failure. Yet these ancient vessels, some with walls merely 2 or 3 millimeters thin, show no stress fractures, no repairs, no evidence of the multiple failures that should characterize any learning process. They appear to have been created successfully on the first attempt, by craftsmen who understood the material's properties so completely that they could work it to tolerances approaching the limits of handwork precision. The conventional explanation for these vessels holds that they were created over many generations by highly skilled artisans, using stone tools and copper implements, employing techniques that evolved gradually over centuries but were eventually lost and are no longer fully understood. The process would have involved roughing out the basic form with stone hammers, gradually refining the shape through abrasion with harder stones or sand, hollowing the interior through patient grinding, and finally polishing the surfaces to the mirror finishes observed on many examples. This explanation is not implausible in principle. Given unlimited time and unlimited patience, human craftsmen can achieve remarkable results with simple tools. The medieval stonemasons who carved Gothic cathedrals created sculptures of extraordinary delicacy using chisels and patience. Japanese sword makers, using traditional methods, produce blades that rival modern metallurgy. Skill accumulated over generations can approach what appears to be mechanical precision. Yet when modern craftsmen attempt to replicate these Egyptian stone vessels using reconstructed ancient methods, the results consistently fall short of the originals in ways that suggest more than mere skill was involved. The British Museum, as part of an experimental archaeology program, commissioned a highly skilled stoneworker to create a stone vessel using only tools that would have been available to pre-dynastic Egyptians. Copper chisels, stone hammers, wooden tools, and abrasive sand. The craftsman selected was experienced in working with stone and understood the properties of the materials involved. After approximately 200 hours of continuous work, he produced a functional vessel from a block of relatively soft limestone. The result was serviceable. It held water. It had approximately the right proportions. But compared to the ancient vessels it attempted to replicate, the differences were striking. The symmetry was approximate rather than precise. One side was noticeably thicker than the other. The surface finish, despite extensive polishing with sand and leather, remained somewhat rough, bearing visible marks from the working process. The curves were irregular, showing the hesitations and corrections inevitable in handwork. The rim was uneven, varying in thickness around its circumference. Most significantly, this vessel was made from limestone, which rates only 3 on the Mohs hardness scale. The ancient vessels that puzzle researchers most are made from materials rating 6, 7, or 8 on that scale. Materials 2 to 5 times harder than limestone. Materials that resist abrasion and fracture unpredictably. Materials that modern craftsmen struggle to work even with carbide tools and diamond abrasives. The ancient vessels show none of the deficiencies present in the modern replication. Their surfaces are polished to mirror finishes that reflect light with minimal distortion. Their symmetry approaches mathematical perfection, with walls that maintain uniform thickness to tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. Their curves are smooth and consistent, following radii that do not vary throughout the form. What makes these vessels truly anomalous is not merely their precision, remarkable though that is, but their number and their chronological context. 40,000 vessels represents an extraordinary investment of resources. If we assume, conservatively, that each vessel required only 100 hours of work using the methods conventionally proposed, the total labor investment would exceed 4 million hours. That translates to approximately 2,000 years of continuous work by a single craftsman working full-time, or proportionally less if multiple craftsmen worked simultaneously. This calculation assumes no failed attempts, no broken vessels discarded during the learning process, no time lost to tool maintenance or material procurement. In reality, the labor investment must have been substantially higher, perhaps by a factor of 2 or 3, accounting for the failures and inefficiencies inevitable in any production process. Such an investment might be plausible if the vessels represented accumulated output of a mature, well-established industry working continuously over many centuries. But according to conventional archaeological chronology, these vessels were created during Egypt's earliest dynastic periods and the pre-dynastic era immediately preceding it, spanning roughly from 3500 BCE to 2700 BCE. This was supposedly a time when Egyptian civilization was still developing its foundational technologies. Writing was just emerging. Monumental architecture was just beginning. Social organization was transitioning from village-level communities to the complex state structures of the First Dynasty. Yet, during this formative period, enormous resources were being devoted to creating stone vessels of extraordinary precision. The archaeological context deepens the mystery. Many of these vessels were found in tombs and burial contexts associated with the First and Second Dynasties, dated roughly between 3100 and 2700 BCE. Some were discovered in even earlier pre-dynastic sites, pushing their creation date back to 3500 BCE or earlier. A few examples have been found in contexts suggesting possible Old Kingdom dates, but the vast majority cluster in the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods. This chronological distribution creates a significant paradox. If these vessels represent the pinnacle of Egyptian stoneworking technology, requiring the highest levels of skill and the most sophisticated understanding of materials and techniques, why do they appear at the very beginning of Egyptian civilization rather than at its height? Why do the earliest periods, when Egyptian culture was supposedly still developing, produce vessels superior to those made later when bronze tools became available, when organizational capabilities improved, when craft specialization became more developed? Later periods in Egyptian history produced plenty of stone vessels, but they are noticeably cruder than the pre-dynastic examples. The walls are thicker and less uniform. The symmetry is approximate. The surface finishes are good, but not exceptional. The complex forms with narrow necks and difficult internal geometries become less common. This pattern is the reverse of what we would expect if the vessels represented a developing technology. Normally, crafts improve over time as knowledge accumulates, techniques are refined, and tools become more sophisticated. The progression should move from crude early attempts toward increasingly refined later examples. The Egyptian stone vessels show the opposite pattern. The earliest examples are the most sophisticated. Quality declines over time. By the Middle Kingdom, stone vessel production has largely ceased, replaced by pottery and metalwork. This inverted development curve has prompted some researchers to propose that the earliest Egyptians did not develop stone vessel technology themselves. Instead, they inherited it, receiving either completed vessels or the knowledge to create them from a preceding culture, whose existence has been largely erased from the archaeological record. This inheritance hypothesis faces significant challenges. It requires a source civilization for which direct evidence remains elusive. It demands explanation for how such a civilization could vanish so completely that only its artifacts remain, with no clear settlements, no cemeteries, no trash middens, no pottery assemblages, none of the normal detritus that civilizations leave behind. It also contradicts the gradualist model of cultural development that dominates archaeological theory. According to this model, complex societies develop incrementally from simpler ones through a series of small innovations, accumulating over long periods.
The sudden appearance of sophisticated capabilities without clear antecedents violates this framework. Yet the artifacts themselves refuse to cooperate with gradualist expectations. They exist, they can be measured, they can be examined, and their precision, their sophistication, sheer number, all resist explanation within the conventional chronology of Egyptian development. The vessels are not unique in presenting this pattern of inverted development. Similar patterns appear throughout early Egyptian material culture, suggesting that the stone vessels may be part of a larger phenomenon requiring explanation. Egyptian hieroglyphic writing appears suddenly in the archaeological record around 3200 BCE, already fully developed with hundreds of signs representing sounds, words, and concepts. There is no clear developmental period during which simpler writing systems evolved into the complex hieroglyphic script. The writing simply appears, mature and sophisticated, as if imported, complete from elsewhere. Egyptian astronomical knowledge, encoded in the alignments of temples and pyramids, demonstrates understanding of precession, the equinoxes, and stellar cycles that should require centuries of careful observation to develop. Yet this knowledge appears to be present from the earliest dynastic periods, without evidence of the observational programs that such knowledge would necessitate. Egyptian mathematical understanding, evident in the proportions of monuments and the calculations required for construction projects, includes concepts like the golden ratio and sophisticated geometric relationships. These appear without clear antecedents in simpler mathematical systems. Each of these anomalies might have an innocent explanation. Knowledge might have developed in regions where archaeological evidence has not survived. Techniques might have been transmitted orally rather than preserved in material form. The developmental periods might have been shorter than we expect, compressed into a few generations of intense innovation. But the accumulation of anomalies begins to sketch a pattern of sophisticated knowledge and capabilities appearing suddenly at the beginning of Egyptian civilization, rather than developing gradually over time. A pattern suggesting inheritance rather than invention. A pattern that some researchers interpret as evidence for a preceding civilization whose achievements were incorporated into early Egyptian culture. The stone vessels remain in museum collections, catalogued and authenticated, their precision measurable, their existence undeniable. They wait patiently for explanations that can account for their sophistication without requiring either abandonment of the evidence or wholesale revision of our understanding of prehistoric capabilities. In the silence of the museum galleries, under controlled temperature and humidity, lit by soft lights that protect their ancient surfaces, the vessels rest as they have rested for millennia. They hold no water now. They serve no ritual function. They are merely objects of study, puzzles in stone, questions carved into granite and diorite and schist, questions about who made them and how and why, questions about knowledge lost and found, about civilizations that rise and fall, about the silence that follows when a culture vanishes and leaves only artifacts behind. The Great Pyramid at Giza stands as the most extensively studied structure in human history, yet it continues to guard secrets that resist conventional explanation, even after more than a century of intensive archaeological investigation. Its base covers 13 acres of the Giza Plateau, precisely leveled to within less than an inch across that entire expanse. Its four sides align to the cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west, with an accuracy that deviates by less than 1/15 of a single degree. This alignment is more precise than most modern buildings achieve without sophisticated surveying equipment and careful measurement. The pyramid's original height, before the loss of its outer casing stones and capstone, was 481 feet, making it the tallest human-made structure on Earth for more than 3,000 years. Its geometric proportions encode mathematical relationships, including the ratio of pi and the golden ratio, phi, suggesting sophisticated understanding of mathematics and geometry. It consists of approximately 2.3 million blocks of limestone and granite, fitted together with extraordinary precision. The joints between blocks are so tight that in many locations a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. Some blocks weigh 2.5 tons, some weigh 15 tons. The largest granite blocks in the King's Chamber weigh between 50 and 80 tons each. The conventional chronology attributes the pyramid's construction to Pharaoh Khufu of the 4th dynasty, dating it to approximately 2560 BCE. According to this timeline, the pyramid was built over a period of approximately 20 years, using a workforce estimated at tens of thousands of laborers, working with copper tools, wooden sledges, ropes, and ramps of uncertain configuration. The mathematics of this construction scenario have troubled engineers since the pyramid was first seriously studied in the modern era. The numbers simply do not cooperate easily with the narrative. 2,300,000 blocks divided by 20 years of construction equals 115,000 blocks per year. Assuming work could only proceed during the seasons when the Nile's flooding didn't interfere, perhaps 250 to 300 working days per year. That becomes somewhere between 380 and 460 blocks per day, divided by a working day of perhaps 10 hours, allowing time for meals and rest. The result is approximately 40 blocks per hour, or one block positioned every 90 seconds, continuously, without interruption, for 10 hours per day, for 300 days per year, for 20 consecutive years. This calculation assumes perfect efficiency. It assumes no time lost to tool maintenance, to moving ramps as the pyramid rises, to surveying and measuring to maintain the precise alignments observed, to cutting and shaping blocks to the precise dimensions required for tight fitting, to solving the logistical problems of moving thousands of workers and millions of tons of stone around a constantly changing construction site. It assumes that blocks could be quarried, shaped, transported across the Nile during flood season or overland during low water, moved to the construction site, lifted to progressively greater heights, and positioned with millimeter precision at a sustained rate of 1 every 90 seconds for 2 decades without significant interruption or slowdown. Some Egyptologists respond to these calculations by noting that they oversimplify the construction process. Not all blocks needed to be placed at the same rate. Work on the foundation levels, where blocks are larger and heavier, but lifting heights are minimal, would proceed differently than work on upper levels, where blocks are smaller, but must be raised hundreds of feet. Multiple crews working on different parts of the pyramid simultaneously could increase the effective placement rate. Furthermore, some researchers argue that the 20-year timeline may be too compressed. Perhaps construction extended over a longer period, Perhaps preparatory work, including quarrying and infrastructure development, occurred before the visible pyramid construction began. Perhaps the labor force was larger than conventionally estimated, or worked more efficiently than modern calculations suggest. These are reasonable points. Construction projects of this scale involve complexities that resist simple mathematical analysis. Labor rates vary with experience and organization. Techniques improve over time. Efficiencies accumulate as workers become more skilled and coordination becomes more refined. Yet even accounting for these factors, the scale and precision of the Great Pyramid present challenges that conventional explanations struggle to fully address. The foundation of the pyramid sits on bedrock that was carefully leveled before construction began. The leveling is so precise that the base is flat to within 1 inch across the entire 13-acre expanse. Achieving this required surveying techniques of remarkable sophistication, methods for establishing level across long distances, and the ability to remove irregular bedrock down to a precision plane. Modern construction achieves such leveling using laser transits and sophisticated surveying equipment. How did 4th Dynasty Egyptians, working with wooden tools and copper implements, achieve comparable results? Some have suggested water-filled trenches used as level references, but the logistics of cutting trenches into bedrock and filling them with water stable enough to serve as precision references present their own challenges. The alignment to cardinal directions is even more puzzling. True north is not magnetic north. It is the direction toward the Earth's rotational axis, which can be determined astronomically by observing stellar positions over time. Modern buildings achieve alignment to true north using sophisticated surveying instruments that can measure angles to fractions of a degree. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north within approximately 1/15 of a degree. This is better alignment than most modern buildings achieve without special effort. It suggests either an extremely careful and time-consuming astronomical survey using methods that have not been clearly identified in the archaeological record, or some technique for establishing direction that we do not currently understand. Inside the pyramid, the engineering challenges multiply. The Grand Gallery, a rising passageway with corbelled walls soaring 28 feet high, maintains nearly perfect alignment over its entire length. The King's Chamber, constructed from massive granite blocks weighing up to 80 tons each, features walls that are perfectly vertical and corners that are precise right angles. The ceiling consists of 9 granite beams, each approximately 27 feet long and weighing between 50 and 80 tons, positioned side by side to form a flat roof that has remained stable and level for more than 4,000 years. How were these beams transported to the chamber? The pyramid has no interior passages wide or tall enough to accommodate beams of this size in any orientation. The only possibility is that they were installed during construction, before the walls and upper portions of the pyramid were built. But this means they had to be positioned at a height of approximately 150 feet above ground level, maneuvered into precise alignment, and set in place with such accuracy that the resulting ceiling remains flat and stable millennia later. The conventional explanation invokes massive internal ramps, elaborate systems of wooden scaffolding, and thousands of workers coordinating to haul these beams into position using rope and muscle power. These explanations are not impossible. Ancient civilizations accomplished remarkable feats of engineering using simple tools and massive labor inputs. The pyramids themselves are evidence of this, but the explanations feel incomplete. They describe what must have happened, but struggle to demonstrate how it could have happened given the constraints of Bronze Age technology and the physical limitations of the structure itself. They invoke capabilities and techniques for which no clear evidence survives in the archaeological record. No contemporary texts describe pyramid construction methods. No tomb paintings depict the building process. No architect is named as the designer. No overseer claims credit for the achievement. The pyramids stand in silence, their construction methods unrecorded, their builders anonymous, their techniques a mystery. This silence is itself anomalous. The ancient Egyptians were enthusiastic record keepers. They documented their military campaigns in elaborate detail. They recorded administrative procedures, tax collections, and resource distributions. They painted scenes of daily life on tomb walls. Farming, fishing, hunting, crafting, trading. They left behind thousands of inscriptions describing the deeds of pharaohs and the duties of priests. Yet for the greatest engineering achievement in their entire civilization, for the construction projects that required the most resources and the most sophisticated technical knowledge, no detailed records survive. This absence demands explanation. Was the knowledge considered too sacred to record? Were the construction methods so well known that documentation seemed unnecessary? Were records created but subsequently lost? Or is the silence evidence of something else? Evidence that the 4th dynasty Egyptians did not actually build the pyramids, but inherited structures created by an earlier culture. Structures they claimed and perhaps renovated, but did not construct from bedrock. This hypothesis, while appealing to some researchers, faces severe challenges from mainstream archaeology. The pyramids contain clear evidence of 4th dynasty construction techniques. The limestone casing blocks bear tool marks consistent with copper chisels. Quarries show evidence of stone extraction using methods documented in other 4th dynasty sites. Graffiti in relieving chambers above the king's chamber includes cartouches bearing Khufu's name, suggesting the pyramid was built during his reign. Yet even this evidence is not without ambiguity. The tool marks could indicate later renovations rather than original construction. The quarries could have been reopened during the 4th dynasty to extract additional stone for repairs or additions to existing structures. The graffiti, while strongly suggesting 4th dynasty activity within the pyramid, does not necessarily prove 4th dynasty construction of the entire monument. Some researchers have noted differences in construction quality between different portions of the Great Pyramid. The lowest courses, built from massive blocks weighing 10 to 15 tons each, are fitted together with extraordinary precision. The joints are tight, the alignment is perfect, the craftsmanship is exceptional. Higher courses use smaller blocks, averaging 2 to 3 tons. The fitting is good, but noticeably less precise than the foundation courses. The blocks are more irregular in size, the joints are wider. The overall construction quality, while still impressive, does not match the perfection of the lowest levels. Some interpret this as evidence of 2 construction phases, an earlier phase using superior techniques and larger blocks, and a later phase using more conventional methods and smaller stones. According to this interpretation, the 4th dynasty Egyptians built upon and completed a structure whose foundation and lower courses were already in place, created by an earlier culture using technology subsequently lost. This theory would explain the sudden appearance of pyramid construction in 4th dynasty Egypt without clear developmental antecedents. The 3rd Dynasty Step Pyramid at Saqqara, built only a generation before the Great Pyramid, uses an entirely different construction technique involving small limestone blocks stacked in layers. The leap from the step pyramid to the true pyramids at Giza represents a technological discontinuity that conventional archaeology struggles to explain. If the earliest Egyptians inherited partially completed structures, or at least inherited the knowledge to create such structures from a preceding culture, the discontinuity becomes comprehensible. The fourth dynasty would represent not the invention of pyramid technology, but its culmination, the final expression of knowledge that had been transmitted from earlier times. But this explanation requires a source for that knowledge, a preceding culture capable of planning and executing projects of this scale and sophistication. And for such a culture, despite decades of intensive archaeological survey across Egypt, no clear evidence has emerged. No. Settlements clearly predating the First Dynasty show the organizational complexity required for such construction. No quarries show evidence of earlier large-scale stone extraction. No tool assemblages suggest technologies beyond those attributed to the Neolithic period. The archaeological record, as currently understood, does not contain the source civilization that the inheritance hypothesis requires. Yet the anomalies persist, the precision persists, the silence persists, and the pyramids stand, massive and enigmatic, their construction methods uncertain, their chronology debated, their very existence a challenge to simple narratives about technological development and civilizational progress. In the desert heat, under the unchanging sun, the pyramids wait. They have waited for 45 centuries, patient and enduring, witnesses to empires that rose and fell, to languages that were spoken and forgotten, to technologies that were invented and lost, and invented again. They keep their secrets well. On the Giza Plateau, east of the Great Pyramid and the Second Pyramid, there crouches a monument that may be older than any human memory can reach. The Great Sphinx measures 73 meters from extended paws to haunches. It rises 20 meters above the desert floor. It was carved from a single outcrop of limestone, its leonine body shaped from the living bedrock of the plateau, its human face gazing perpetually toward the sunrise, toward the east, toward the place where the sun emerges each dawn from beyond the horizon. According to conventional Egyptology, the Sphinx was carved during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, builder of the Second Pyramid at Giza, making it contemporary with that pyramid and dating it to approximately 2500 BCE. This chronology rests on several lines of evidence, including stylistic similarity between the Sphinx's face and statues of Khafre, proximity to Khafre's Pyramid Causeway and Valley Temple, and the absence of earlier references to the monument in Egyptian text. But in 1991, a Boston University geologist named Robert Schoch stood in the Sphinx enclosure and observed something that would challenge this chronology and ignite a controversy still unresolved decades later. The walls of the Sphinx enclosure, the deep trench carved into the bedrock from which the Sphinx's body was hewn, display unusual weathering patterns. The limestone surfaces are eroded into deep, undulating vertical channels, wave-like patterns carved by water flowing down the stone faces over extended periods. Schoch, a geologist specializing in weathering patterns and rock erosion, recognized these patterns as characteristic of precipitation weathering rather than wind or sand erosion. This type of weathering, he argued, requires prolonged exposure to substantial rainfall, to water flowing consistently down stone surfaces over many centuries or even millennia. The implications of this observation struck at the foundation of Egyptian chronology. For the past 4,500 years, the Giza Plateau has been arid. Annual rainfall averages less than an inch. The dominant weathering forces are wind-driven sand and occasional desert storms. The climate has been dry throughout all of recorded Egyptian history, from the First Dynasty around 3100 BCE to the present day. Yet the Sphinx enclosure walls show weathering characteristic of much wetter conditions that have not prevailed in this region for thousands of years. If Schock's interpretation is correct, the Sphinx could not have been carved in 2500 BCE during the arid period. It would need to predate the onset of aridity in Egypt, pushing its construction back to a time when the climate was wetter, when regular rains fell on the Giza Plateau, when the environment was fundamentally different from what we know today. The last time Egypt experienced such conditions was during the African humid period, an era when increased monsoon activity brought substantially more rainfall to North Africa. This period began around 9000 BCE as the last ice age ended and lasted until approximately 5000 to 6000 years ago, when the climate shifted to the arid conditions that persist to the present. If the Sphinx weathering truly indicates exposure to these wetter conditions, the monument could date anywhere from 7000 BCE to 10,000 BCE, or even earlier. This would make it 5,000 to 7,000 years older than conventional Egyptology suggests, placing its creation not in the age of the pharaohs, but in the Neolithic period, or even earlier, in an age when Egypt was supposedly populated only by hunter-gatherers and early farming communities living in small villages along the Nile. This conclusion contradicts fundamental assumptions about the development of civilization. According to conventional archaeology, complex societies capable of organizing and executing large-scale construction projects did not exist anywhere in the world in 7000 BCE. Monumental building appears in the archaeological record only after agriculture had been established long enough to generate the food surpluses needed to support specialist craftsmen and the social hierarchies needed to organize labor. Egypt in 7000 BCE possessed none of these prerequisites. The region was home to scattered communities of early farmers, people who grew primitive wheat and barley, herded cattle and goats, made simple pottery and stone tools, and lived in temporary or semi-permanent settlements that left minimal archaeological trace. These communities, however successful at survival, showed no signs of the organizational complexity required to plan, coordinate, and execute a project like the Sphinx. They had no writing. They had no apparent hierarchy beyond family or clan structures. They had no monumental architecture. They had no precedent for stone sculpture on this scale. How could such communities have created the Sphinx? This question has driven mainstream Egyptologists to reject Schock's weathering hypothesis emphatically. They have proposed alternative explanations for the erosion patterns observed in the Sphinx enclosure. Some suggest that the weathering could result from groundwater seepage, from water percolating through the limestone from the water table below. Others propose that Nile floodwaters, which in ancient times reached higher levels than today, could have contributed to the erosion. Still others argue that dew accumulation in the cool desert nights, combined with salt weathering and wind erosion, could produce similar patterns over sufficient time. Schock has responded to each of these counter-arguments, maintaining that none of the alternative explanations adequately account for the specific weathering profile observed. Groundwater seepage, he notes, produces different erosion patterns, typically weathering stone from below, rather than creating the top-down vertical channels visible on the Sphinx enclosure walls. Flood. Waters would have affected other nearby structures similarly. Yet contemporary tombs and monuments show no comparable erosion. Dew and salt weathering operate too slowly to produce the observed effects within the conventional timeframe. More tellingly, Schock points to comparison sites that provide controls for his hypothesis. The tombs carved into the limestone cliffs surrounding the Giza Plateau definitively dated to the Old Kingdom period around 2500 BCE, based on inscriptions and archaeological context, do not show the same erosion patterns as the Sphinx enclosure. These tombs display weathering characteristic of wind and sand abrasion, pitting, flaking, and gradual surface degradation, but not the deep vertical channels seen at the Sphinx. If the Sphinx was carved at the same time as these tombs, as conventional chronology suggests, it should show similar weathering patterns. The fact that it shows markedly different erosion suggests different exposure history, different age, different environmental conditions during the critical weathering period. The controversy has persisted for more than 3 decades without resolution. Mainstream Egyptology remains committed to the conventional dating, citing the overwhelming weight of archaeological context and the absence of any evidence for complex societies in Egypt during the Neolithic period. A minority of geologists and independent researchers find Schoch's arguments compelling, maintaining that geological evidence should take precedence over archaeological assumptions. What makes this debate particularly significant is not merely the question of the Sphinx's age, but what that age would imply about human history. If the Sphinx truly dates to 7000 BCE or earlier, it would require us to fundamentally reconsider our understanding of Neolithic capabilities and the development of civilization. A monument of the Sphinx's scale requires more than just labor. It requires planning. Someone must have conceived this design, selected the site, organized the workforce. It requires surveying. The monument's orientation must be established and maintained throughout the carving process. It requires sustained effort. Carving thousands of tons of limestone from bedrock would have taken many years, even with a large workforce. It requires social organization. Workers must be fed, housed, coordinated, and motivated to complete a project whose purpose might not be immediately practical. Above all, it requires a culture that values such monumental expression, that considers the enormous investment of resources worthwhile, that possesses the cultural and symbolic frameworks that make monument building meaningful. Do we have any evidence that such a culture existed in 7000 BCE Egypt? Not in the conventional archaeological record, but perhaps the Sphinx itself is that evidence. A monument standing in defiance of conventional chronologies, weathered by rains that fell when the world was younger, carved by hands we cannot identify, expressing purposes we can only guess. The Sphinx is not alone in presenting chronological puzzles. The Valley Temple and the Sphinx Temple, massive structures built from enormous limestone and granite blocks, weighing up to 200 tons each, stand immediately adjacent to the Sphinx and show similar weathering patterns. These temples were supposedly built as part of Khafre's pyramid complex, yet their construction technique differs markedly from other 4th dynasty architecture. The temples use megalithic limestone blocks for their core structure, blocks far larger than those used in the pyramids or other Old Kingdom buildings. These massive blocks are stacked without mortar, fitted together with precision, and in many places show the same vertical weathering channels observed on the Sphinx enclosure walls. If these temples are contemporary with the Sphinx, if they too date to a much earlier period than conventionally accepted, then we are looking not at a single anomalous monument, but at an entire architectural complex predating Egyptian civilization. We are looking at evidence of capabilities and culture that have been erased from history, that survive only in stone, too massive to destroy and too enigmatic to ignore. Some researchers have proposed that the Sphinx began as a natural rock formation that was later modified by 4th dynasty Egyptians. Perhaps erosion had already shaped the limestone outcrop into a form suggestive of a reclining animal. Perhaps Khafre's sculptors simply refined what nature had begun, carving the features and details, but not creating the basic form. This compromise position attempts to reconcile the weathering evidence with the archaeological context. It allows for older weathering while maintaining 4th dynasty agency in the monument's creation. But this explanation faces its own challenges. The Sphinx is not a slightly modified natural formation, but a fully realized sculpture with carefully planned proportions, precisely carved details, and architectural elements like the enclosure walls that cannot be explained as natural features. Others suggest that the head of the Sphinx, which does show stylistic similarity to 4th dynasty sculpture, may have been recarved from an earlier form. According to this theory, the original Sphinx may have had a different head, perhaps fully leonine rather than human, which was later modified by 4th dynasty sculptors to resemble Khafre. This would explain why the head appears disproportionately small relative to the body, a feature that has troubled researchers for decades. The head is carved in harder limestone than the body and shows less weathering, which could indicate later reworking. The face, while conventionally attributed to Khafre, could represent a 4th dynasty reinterpretation of an earlier monument whose original purpose and appearance had been forgotten. These theories multiply, each attempting to resolve the contradictions between geological evidence and archaeological context, between weathering patterns and chronological frameworks, between what the stones suggest and what conventional history allows. Meanwhile, the Sphinx itself remains silent. It gazes toward the east, toward the rising sun, as it has gazed for millennia uncounted. Its body is worn by time and weather, its features softened by erosion, its meaning obscured by the centuries that separate us from its creation. In the cool hours before dawn, when the desert is still and the first light begins to touch the eastern horizon, the Sphinx waits. It has waited through the rise and fall of dynasties, through the coming and going of empires, through ages when its origins were remembered, and ages when they were forgotten. It waits still, patient and enigmatic, a riddle carved in stone, a question without an answer, a monument to something we no longer understand. 12,000 years ago, the world as we know it did not exist. Sea levels were 400 feet lower than today. Coastlines extended far beyond their current positions. Land bridges connected continents now separated by deep water. The climate was colder, drier, harsher. Vast ice sheets covered northern latitudes. Glaciers descended from mountains that are now ice-free, and human communities, scattered across landscapes that would later be drowned by rising seas, lived in a world that was ending. This was the close of the last ice age, the final chapter of the Pleistocene epoch. For nearly 100,000 years, ice had dominated the northern hemisphere. Human populations had adapted to glacial conditions, developing strategies for survival in environments that would kill the unprepared. They had learned to hunt megafauna, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, animals that would not survive into the warmer world coming. Then, around 14,700 years ago, the ice began to melt. The warming was not gradual or steady. It occurred in pulses and reversals, sudden shifts and temporary returns to colder conditions.
Around 12,900 years ago, temperatures plunged again in what geologists call the Younger Dryas, a brief but intense return to near glacial conditions, lasting approximately 1,200 years. When the Younger Dryas ended around 11,700 years ago, warming resumed and accelerated. The consequences were catastrophic for communities living in coastal regions. Meltwater from collapsing ice sheets poured into the oceans at rates that raised sea levels by several meters per century in some periods. Coastlines retreated inland. River deltas drowned. Coastal plains that had supported human communities for thousands of years vanished beneath the waves. This is not speculation. It is established geological fact. The evidence exists in seafloor cores, in drowned river valleys, in submerged beach terraces, in the geological record of rapid sea level
rise during the transition from Pleistocene to Holocene. What remains speculative is the nature of the human communities affected by this flooding, the extent of their cultural development, the sophistication of their knowledge and capabilities. Conventional archaeology assumes that human societies during the late Pleistocene were primarily hunter-gatherer bands, mobile groups following animal migrations and seasonal resources, possessing stone tool technologies, but little else that would survive in the archaeological record. But increasingly, evidence suggests this picture may be incomplete. Discoveries at sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9,600 BCE, have demonstrated that late Pleistocene and early Holocene communities were capable of monumental architecture, sophisticated stone carving, and social organization far exceeding what was previously believed possible for pre-agricultural societies. Göbekli Tepe consists of massive stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, carved with intricate reliefs depicting animals, abstract symbols, and anthropomorphic figures. These pillars were erected in circular enclosures, carefully positioned and aligned, creating what may have been ceremonial or astronomical structures. The site predates agriculture in the region by at least 1,000 years, suggesting that complex societies could exist without the agricultural surplus, conventionally considered necessary for monument building. If communities in Turkey in 9,600 BCE could create Göbekli Tepe, what might communities in other regions have achieved? What capabilities might have existed in coastal areas now submerged, in river valleys now drowned, in regions where the archaeological record has been obliterated by rising seas and millennia of erosion? This is where the hypothesis of a pre-Egyptian civilization finds its theoretical foundation. If advanced communities existed during the late Pleistocene in regions that were later drowned, if those communities developed sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and stoneworking, and if survivors of those communities migrated inland as sea levels rose, they could have brought their knowledge to regions like the Nile Valley, where conditions favored preservation of their legacy. The early dynastic Egyptians might then represent not a civilization developing from Neolithic origins, but a fusion culture, indigenous Nile Valley communities adopting and adapting knowledge brought by refugees from a drowned coastal civilization. This would explain the sudden appearance of advanced capabilities in early Egypt without clear local developmental periods.
It would account for the astronomical knowledge encoded in pyramid alignments, knowledge requiring centuries of observation to develop. It would explain the sophisticated stone-working techniques appearing fully formed at the beginning of Egyptian civilization. The evidence for this hypothesis is necessarily indirect. If the source civilization existed primarily in coastal regions now underwater, direct archaeological evidence would be extraordinarily difficult to obtain. Underwater archaeology has made remarkable strides in recent decades, but surveying the vast expanses of continental shelf that were exposed during the Ice Age remains largely beyond current capabilities. What we have instead are hints, suggestions, anomalies that point toward something missing from our historical understanding. The precision stone vessels from pre-dynastic Egypt suggest inherited knowledge rather than gradual development. The megalithic architecture at sites like the Osirian suggests construction techniques imported from elsewhere. The astronomical alignments of Old Kingdom monuments suggest observational programs extending far beyond what could have been accomplished in the few centuries between Egypt's unification and the Pyramid Age. Egyptian mythology itself contains suggestive elements. The concept of Zep, Tepi, the first time, a golden age when gods walked the earth and taught humanity the arts of civilization, appears repeatedly in religious texts. References to a primordial flood, to an age before the current age, to knowledge passed down from ancient predecessors, permeate Egyptian cosmology. Mainstream Egyptology interprets these mythological elements as purely symbolic, as allegories expressing religious and philosophical concepts rather than preserving historical memory. But myths sometimes contain kernels of historical truth, distorted by transmission across generations. The biblical flood narrative, dismissed for centuries as pure mythology, gained new respect after archaeological evidence confirmed catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia during the early Bronze Age. Could Egyptian flood myths preserve genuine memory of the sea level rise that drowned coastal communities at the end of the Ice Age? Could references to a golden age reflect actual contact with survivors who possessed knowledge from an earlier, more sophisticated culture? Could the concept of gods teaching humanity represent cultural memory of knowledge transmission from a source whose origins had been forgotten? These questions resist definitive answers. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The chronological gaps are significant. The absence of clear archaeological remains from the proposed source civilization remains the strongest argument against the hypothesis. Yet the anomalies persist, and around the world, not just in Egypt, similar patterns appear. In South America, the precision stone fitting at sites like Sacsayhuaman in Peru demonstrates capabilities that seem inconsistent with the conventional chronology of Andean civilization. Massive blocks weighing hundreds of tons are fitted together with such precision that the joints are barely visible. The construction techniques required remain unclear. The chronology remains debated. In Lebanon, the Baalbek temple complex includes foundation stones weighing over 800 tons, among the largest work stone blocks in the world. How these blocks were moved and positioned remains unexplained. When they were originally emplaced is uncertain, though Roman construction clearly built upon earlier foundations. On the Yonaguni coast of Japan, underwater formations have been discovered that some researchers interpret as artificial structures. Stepped pyramids, carved channels, geometric shapes. Mainstream geology largely considers these natural formations, but their geometric regularity continues to provoke debate. If artificial, they would have been constructed when the area was above water during the late Pleistocene. Off the coast of India, sonar surveys have detected formations resembling urban planning. Regular streets, geometric foundations, rectilinear structures. These formations lie beneath hundreds of feet of water in regions that would have been coastal plains during the Ice Age. Definitive investigation remains incomplete, but the sonar data has sustained interest in the possibility of submerged settlements. In the Atlantic Ocean, the Azores Plateau has been proposed as a possible location for Plato's Atlantis. While mainstream science considers Atlantis entirely fictional, some researchers note that Plato's description includes specific details, including the date of 9600 BCE for Atlantis's destruction, that seem oddly precise for pure invention. Each of these examples remains controversial. Each faces skepticism from mainstream archaeology. Each requires additional evidence before definitive conclusions can be drawn. But taken together, they sketch a pattern of anomalies distributed globally, a pattern suggesting that our understanding of late Pleistocene and early Holocene human capabilities may be incomplete. The hypothesis of lost civilizations faces a fundamental challenge: the requirement for extraordinary evidence to support extraordinary claims. The burden of proof lies with those proposing revisions to established chronologies. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but in archaeology, physical evidence ultimately determines what can be claimed about the past. Yet the absence of evidence for coastal civilizations drowned by sea level rise may be circumstantial rather than fundamental. We have not systematically surveyed the continental shelves. We have not conducted extensive underwater archaeology in the regions most likely to contain remains of late Pleistocene coastal communities. The absence of discovered evidence may reflect the absence of adequate investigation, rather than the absence of remains to discover. As technology improves, as underwater survey capabilities advance, as remote sensing techniques become more sophisticated, the submerged coastal regions may yet yield surprises. Perhaps we will find evidence of more complex late Pleistocene societies than currently accepted. Perhaps we will discover that knowledge and capabilities existed earlier than conventional chronology allows. Perhaps we will find the missing links that would connect the anomalies observed in early civilizations to source communities whose existence has been inferred but not proven. Or perhaps we will find that the anomalies have simpler explanations, that human ingenuity working with simple tools can account for the precision observed in ancient artifacts, that the patterns we interpret as evidence of inheritance can be explained by independent invention, that the mysteries dissolve when examined with sufficient rigor. For now, we remain suspended between possibilities. The evidence is fragmentary. The interpretations are contested. The questions outnumber the answers, and the monuments stand in silence, built by hands unknown, expressing purposes we can only imagine, preserving knowledge we struggle to comprehend. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the desert wind moves softly across ancient stones, when the stars wheel overhead in patterns that have guided navigators for millennia, when the boundary between past and present grows thin, the monuments wait. They have waited through ages of remembering and ages of forgetting. They have waited through civilizations that rose and fell, through languages that were spoken and went silent, through knowledge that was preserved and knowledge that was lost. They wait still, patient and enduring, these stones that remember, these monuments to human aspiration and achievement, these silent witnesses to the possibility that we are not the first to reach for understanding, not the first to build, not the first to seek permanence in a world of change. The Sphinx gazes toward the dawn. The pyramids stand aligned to cardinal directions. The stone vessels rest in museum cases, their precision measurable, their creation mysterious. The granite blocks bear grooves cut with impossible accuracy. The weathered walls whisper of rains that fell, and the world was different.
And we, standing before them in the 21st century, armed with technology our ancestors could not imagine, yet humbled by achievements we cannot replicate, must ask ourselves what we have forgotten, what has been lost, what knowledge might lie buried beneath the sand or drowned beneath the sea, waiting for those with eyes to see and minds willing to question. The civilization that vanished before Egypt, if it existed, left no written records we can read, no cities we have found, no clear legacy we can definitively claim. What it may have left is something more subtle and more profound. The echo of capabilities we did not know were possible, the suggestion of knowledge we thought belonged only to later ages, the intimation that human history is deeper and stranger than our textbooks teach. In the end, we are left with the evidence itself. The stones, the measurements, the precision, the alignments, the anomalies that refuse to be easily explained or conveniently dismissed. We are
Left with questions. And perhaps that is the greatest gift these ancient monuments offer. Not answers, but questions. Not certainty, but wonder. Not conclusions, but the invitation to continue searching, continue measuring, continue questioning our assumptions about who we are and where we come from. The stones remember, and in their silence, they speak.